So thank you all for coming tonight to this topic about Sook, the slave named Sook. So the story goes, and I'm not one to fully give you the depth of the story, but having researched as best I could, the information that I've been able to gather. How I found this project basically was that someone was from my Alabama research group area. Someone was actually a member of this group. And then someone felt that this might be a group that I could be interested in researching through. So I went to the group. I saw that this gentleman was in the group, and I said, "Oh, if he's in the group, I should be in the group." So we joined these groups looking for connections and looking to try to understand our ancestral story. So, having joined the group, I was able to watch the documentary that was done. And moving that it was so well done. I really loved how the story was created. Being able to see them as slaves at the furnace and just the representation of that, it was moving to me. And so I was encouraged to go on the website, and then I saw the will, Baker Johnson's will. And having done my own personal research, having read the slaves that were listed in Baker Johnson's will, two names stood out for me. One name was Sook, and the other name was Betty. And something in my spirit said, I think this is my Sook, but now I need to learn more to be able to really see if it is. And I started that journey the spring of this year, around March, April ish, when I started following the group. And then since that time, just trying to continue to learn and research information, just trying to get a glimmer understanding of, is this Sook my Sook? Am I really connected to the enslaved at the Catoctin Furnace or just in the area? What is there a connection? So tonight, this is so I really what I will tell you is before I bring my research of my enslaved family to the body of my having researched my family to the body that I call my cousins. I try to cross my T's and dot my I's. However, there had just been some conversations that basically was trying to I don't know the proper word, basically say my if there is a Sook and it's mentioned that it's a different Sook or connected to me, then I was false and I basically am incorrect. And so it's hard when you're trying to do your best to do what you're trying to do. So I said, okay, well then let me just show you what I have to date. And so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to show you the research that I've gathered to date. So could Baker Johnson, Sook of Frederick, Maryland, be Delbra Sook of Jefferson, Georgia? So this is going to be that conversation of all the information that I've been able to gather pertaining to the Frederick area, pertaining to my own personal research area of my ancestor, and how I strongly believe that I'm going to share. I pray I'll share tonight the information that will help you to be able to say, I'm going to say 90%. There's always going to be more information we have to continue to research. But let me get started. So before I jump into is my Sook my Sook, I have to give you the backstory of some information, right? Some history. Because this is some history I had to learn myself just to be able to understand the time period that we're talking about. So I'm not talking about an ancestor that was born in the 1800s. I'm talking about ancestors that were born in the 1700s, late 1700s, or even mid 1700s. And so I had to come up to speed with understanding what was going on in that period of time. So one of the things I wanted to make sure that I understood was the order that the states were admitted into the Union. So we know there was the first 13 colonies, but it's important to understand those dates because when we're talking about, we're looking at when slaves were born and where were they located. And not only was the state admitted, but some of the territories and some of the counties were not even established for some of the time periods we're looking at. Maybe it was still Native American territory. So I'm just sharing this because we're looking at Delaware, which was 1787, and there were a group of states that came in at that time. Then South Carolina creeps in here. I'm seeing Maryland should have been highlighted in red. That creeps in here. Virginia, New York, North Carolina. And then when some of the other subsequent states were added. Because what's important, and the reason why I want to share this part, is when we're looking at the colonies, right? The initial time periods when they came and they took the land and they were starting to determine how were they going to work, were they going to earn their keep, their monies, or whatever they were doing. As new territories opened up, well, then they needed to be able to move into those territories, clear that land, and they needed labor and they needed a workforce. And so we have to be thinking about, some of us have ties to Louisiana, some of us have ties to Mississippi. And so, as our ancestors, our early on ancestors, were here in America and enslaved, as these territories opened up, and those enslavers might have taken our ancestors to another state because they purchased land or they got land grants. Well, then that's when we're starting to see what looks so weird to us, that we have a connection over in Mississippi or Louisiana or even Arkansas. And it's like, how? When my family was in Maryland or my family was in Alabama, how come do I have this connection to tie over there? So I really just wanted to be able to identify and help us to understand, keep in mind dates and the locations and time period, because it became a major factor as to why our ancestors were separated from their core family and moved all around. So the next thing I'm adding here has to do with, and I've enlarged this PowerPoint. So that's one reason why I'm not showing it as a show. I have to enlarge it. And so I am using a portrait view. But we have to understand indentured servitude versus chattel slavery. I didn't start focusing on that until this year. And there is definitely was a difference between indentured servitude, because many of our ancestors came over here to work in this country with the promise to be free after 7 years.
Right.
However, upon that promise to be free, they did not realize that when they were end up having to be forced into having sex with either a slave owner, the overseer, someone who's managing them, and now they're having mulatto children. Or you also actually had Europeans who were women choosing to marry slaves. When that occurred, they not only added 7 more years to their term of indentured servitude, but they added 31 years to their children as slaves. And so now there became this conversation, an issue between being free versus not being free. And why are you not free if you knew there was supposed to have been a promise of freedom for your ancestor that should have trickled down to you over a period of time? So if we're looking at the 1660s and now all of a sudden it's 1700 or mid 1700s, what was going on at that period of time that would allow them to want to fight for freedom? And did they do anything to try to earn their freedom? So this was just a conversation. I'm not reading all of this stuff. You guys can read it. You can Google it. You can do what I did. But it was something I had to come to learn, that the difference between this chattel slavery versus indentured servitude. And I never imagined that my ancestors could have been free persons of color, that I'll talk about in a minute. And now this is a conversation about what became a part of chattel slavery, the slave codes that was mentioned earlier on, but court decisions. So now the case of number 4, there was a legal case of Mr. John Punch in 1640, was an example of, he was an African indentured servant who attempted to escape and was sentenced to serve for life. And so now we're starting to see how we're coming to America with the promise to try to be free, but then now all of a sudden the turn got flipped and now we're enslaved. And how are we fighting our way out of that when where's the law, And so once the slaves started having children, now new laws started being erected in slave codes and what they termed as slave codes. The different laws that basically would state that your children were enslaved because you had sex with enslaver. And so now a slave had sex with an enslaver. So now basically your children, you got to calculate when will your term for freedom be up. And so this is just really just talking about again that time frame, because when we're looking at the time period of our ancestor, we just want to make sure we're understanding what was going on in that period of time. And this is just talking about those transition of laws and how they are moving from hiring people to enslaving them for what they deem to be life, and the laws that they had to erect as they were having children and doing different things like that that were occurring. So this is a map that I pulled together. It's not, and this was the area we're talking about, right? Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania. It's an older map in Virginia. But it was an image that I found, which was interesting because we know in this period of time, farming, grain, and being identified as a general farmer. Iron, and that's where we are seeing the Catoctin Furnace and all of the different iron work locations are pivotal to understand, because if you were trained or if you came to America as an indentured servant or a slave because you had the skills as an iron worker, well, I had asked the question, where were all the iron working locations that they might have been able to be, they may have been hired out to work over here and to work over there. And so that became another way that they became separated and distanced from their family. So the little leaf basically represents on the map tobacco. And iron basically are bars in this map. And so I'm looking for Catoctin, but I'm sure Hagerstown has an iron bar, Boonesboro, Frederick, Blackensburg, down here near Georgetown. There's Blackensburg. And so when we're looking to understand up there near Pennsylvania, in the little upper corner, and right there, there was Elkton and maybe another Susquehanna or Havre de Grace. I think that's Havre de Grace is where that iron bar is. So as we're talking about, Catoctin had iron workers and the workforce that was needed to keep the not just the the iron working location, but to sustain the enslavers' families and the stores and general and the cooks, the labor force that was necessary and needed. So it's important to understand that I'm sure over time there were more locations than what's this map, but this became a really cool visual of keeping in mind of in those areas what was going on. Now, this is a conversation about, and you may not necessarily see the names on the map, but this is the GU 272, the basically the locations in 1838 where slaves were sold from Georgetown, the Georgetown University, the Georgetown Memory Project, and they were shipped to Louisiana. Now that's 1838. And many of the ancestors I'm looking at, I'm researching, we're talking about late 1700s, just post the Revolutionary War. So between the Revolutionary War and 1838, there's 40 years. 40 years of information that we still need to make sure we're tracking as to our enslaved ancestors. And especially if we know that we're back to early 1800s, right? Many of us are able to easily get to 1800s. Well, I always said if I see you were born in 1810, 1820, but then your parent was born about 1790, give or take a couple of years. So that means I'm looking for ancestors in the late 1700s. And so as I come to understand the relationship, this is just a visual map of the relationship between the Georgetown University locations where slaves were sent to Louisiana, sold to Louisiana, and Frederick. Frederick is the upper left corner, which is number 7. And what's pivotal for us to understand about these locations that I'll identify in the next slide screens. So the Bohemia Plantation in Cecil County, you'll see in the next slides, they listed the names of the people who were sold. So this is about people in a family who were sold to Louisiana. And what's most striking and pivotal is not just the time period, but the names and the surnames. So this is the White Marsh, Anne Arundel County location, which is really number 2, not the number 3. In Anne Arundel, White Marsh, the names you see here on this screen are the people who were sold to Louisiana. And what's important is paying attention to, as we're seeing matches to the surname Queen or Hawkins, Blacklock is a surname. Diggs is another name. Francis, West. So as we're possibly wondering about the slaves in Frederick, my question was always, where's your parents? Where's your family? Because Frederick was not created until a latter period of time. And it has been shared by Elizabeth that, and that's what really piqued my interest and made me really cognizant of this area. Charles Carroll sold slaves to the Johnson brothers in Catoctin and Frederick. So those slaves had to come from somewhere. And Charles Carroll, you'll see later, it was a huge, owned many slaves in this area. And so this was just at the White Marsh Plantation, the slaves who were sold. And this is another location, which is 3, the Joseph Plantation in Talbot County. I didn't see, I'm sure there were names, I just didn't have the information to tell me those names. Number 4, St. Thomas in Charles County. I believe it was Charles County. These are those names. Queen again, Butler again. There are some, and the ones in reds are the ones that I feel are pivotal to me in my research and my connection to the surname Queen. As we're connecting to one another and as we're starting to see these names Queens and we're trying to understand the connections, that's why we're coming together, is to understand those connections and build those familial connections and lines. So the next one is Newtown Manor and where it was located. And this is just really more visuals to help us to understand these slaves in Frederick came from somewhere. They didn't originate in Frederick. So there's many people, not just Frederick, it could be Alabama. We're so stuck on the family that has been here for 100 years, maybe 150 years, but they came here from somewhere. And myself, Emily, many of us that's connecting, we did not remain in Maryland. We did not remain in Virginia or even Pennsylvania. Our families were taken from these areas, and we're trying to connect backwards to these areas. So there were a few locations. This is the, say, Indigos. As we're paying attention to the GU 272 project, we're hearing these different locations, we're hearing these different plantations and names. If we're having DNA matches to the name Mahoney, Butler, Yorkshire, I actually have a Jed match connection to the Yorkshire name, which was surprising to me. And so now that what that means is I really need to go research that a little bit more because Yorkshires are connected to me. Hills are connected to me. Goes, I believe, Gough, are connected to me. And the question is one thing to be connected, but it's how. And then this last one, these are the names of the people who ended up in Louisiana. In Maringouin, Iberville Parish in Louisiana. And so when we're really trying to understand a Louisiana connection, we have to go back in history and understand those connections. Yesterday, I did a conversation about the free persons of color. And what's important about that is going back to the conversation I had about the slaves when they were indentured. So yes, your children were enslaved for 31 years, but after those 31 years, they really were like, we should be freed. What can we do? And so they went to court. They went to court to fight for their freedom. And so these are some of the the people who are considered indentured servants in Maryland in the 17th, 18th century, who really are our descendants. And this is something I want you guys to understand. When I'm connected to you, and I'm connected to Crystal, and I'm connected to Rodney, and I'm connected to different people, as we're going backwards in time, it's like, why are you all so closely connected to me? Because what I am seeing is that we are descendants of some of those initial people who came here to America, whether they were enslaved or whether they were indentured. But as we are seeing these connections in this Maryland area, Virginia area, Irish Nell, she was an Irish indentured servant who purposely married a black man named Charles Butler. So now we're understanding, wait, Butler, I have some Butler connections, but I don't know why and where. And as we're going further back, this is where some of those original connections are coming from. The Queen name, Mary Pawpaw Queen. Mary Pawpaw Queen, and the story that's around her, her family, I believe, was one, or the Butlers or Mary Pawpaw were one of the first two original people who took people to court. And when they won, they hundreds of people that were in their family became free. So whereas we're looking at census records in the first census, and we're seeing one free person one free slave is recorded in the census, or in the 1800 census, we're seeing free slave. We're like, how are they freed? Why were they freed? What's the backstory to that freedom? There is no shared immediate story as to how were they free. Are you finding you're related to the surname Key, as this says, which is also Thomas Keene? Many times they changed their name. Were they running for something? I read an article where someone wanted more land, so his father came over as McQueen. He changed his name to Queen. And I have a DNA match in Ancestry, which is a high match, to the Queen name through an African American person and a white person. And so this is something that I have to pay attention to. Grawweir, definitely a different name for me. Coswell, I have seen this name. I can't say I've seen it for myself. Many of you may possibly have seen these surnames as some of your masters that you're researching. Driggers, Chambers. And we're talking about Chambers was 1662. Matthias de Sousa, Portuguese descendant. And we're wondering where some of these, ancestral connections are coming from. Francis Gray, Jane Webb, another person named Driggers, Angelo. I don't know if that's a first or last name, but the Roth family's indentured servants. So, and then the unknown servants of Jesuit missions. And the Jesuits were Catholic priests. And so they set themselves up to have slaves, to run their colleges or to run their churches, and to set up for, Georgetown University, where they wanted to have a university to educate and teach people about faith, but they enslaved people. And one thing that's not in the slide, there was so much I wanted to add to the slide. One thing the Jesuits did, a couple of things, as the women started having mulatto children, at one period of time, the Jesuits looked and said, where are these mulatto children coming from? You guys are having sex with these slaves. So they sold the slaves. They sold the mulatto children. Where's the tracking of who were the people that were sold away from those families? Then another period of time, they made a decision that if you were 45 years or up, you were too old and not really financially beneficial to them, so they sold you. And so these are the things that have separated us from our families. And we're trying to scramble to figure out how to build those connections. This is not legible, Rodney. But this is basically a link, a document of a link I shared yesterday, and there are other links out there that the research group will be looking at, where this is a free person of color. But now I purposely was looking for who were the free persons of color in Frederick. So this is basically me searching that website, 1723, 1740 is the time period, Peck family. So this is, if you're possibly related to the Pecks in Frederick, then this is a document outlining the family, the children, their children. And now we'll get an understanding of how to add those names to our tree. This document here is the Pearl family. Yesterday, I was sharing the document that was showing those free persons of color out of Maryland, and I remembered seeing that Pearl name, and it was something that I did add to this presentation today. So this is just really stating Robert Pearl, born 1686, was freed April 14, 1713, in Princess George's County, will of Richard Marsham. What I will tell you, when many of them took them to court, many of those enslavers did not want to free them. So there's a few things they did. They either did not answer the summons, did not go to court, stalled it for years, and many purposely said, I will sell them, and they purposely sold the slaves instead of allowing them to be freed. Where did they sell them to? So these are the questions that I end up having to keep in my head, you know? So this is the backstory I wanted to give, just pertaining to the things that we have to consider when I'm trying to figure out how can Sook be connected to Frederick, and how can we be connected to each other. So as a part of trying to outline this possible relationship connection, what I'm sharing with you is how I feel I've been able to triangulate my Sook of Georgia to the Sook of Frederick, utilizing these individuals on this slide. Crystal, Donald, myself, and Rodney. So basically, not only looking at our DNA, looking at our family trees, looking for the matches that we share in common, and then looking at their trees, are we able to see a common thread that helps us to understand where these slaves could have gone from Frederick after Baker Johnson died? So yesterday we had an opportunity to look at Crystal's tree. And looking at Crystal's wiki tree, basically her and I and many people in the group matched her at the 6th common ancestor to the 7th common ancestor. Well, that takes us back to either Robert Patterson or Edward Proctor, or Edward's wife, actually. I believe it was more the wife, Rachel, who I should have added to this, because Rachel married into the Proctor, but she came from, her family's name. And understanding that, this is one connection of the DNA is saying you're related here. Now the question is how. So when looking at Crystal's information, taking her DNA, we were able to see yesterday with Crystal and myself and others in the group that I asked Crystal, can you search your DNA for the name Hannah? Can you search your DNA for the name Wiggum? My Sook out of Georgia, she actually was enslaved by the surname Hannah. There were many other surnames I'll share later, but she had a descendant who married into the name Wiggum, who was enslaved in the name Wiggum. So the Hannah, someone of Hannah, a female, married someone which was a Wiggum. And as I asked Crystal to look in her matches, she was able to see that she did have some matches out of this area to Wiggums and or to Hannah. So this was one possible connection that I was able to glean with Crystal to say, you're matching Hannah's and you're matching Wiggum's. We need to investigate this further, but you definitely are matched to me through these names. She matches me on more than just those names, but to start, these were some of the names that we could look at. And in looking at her DNA, I did a search for the name Wiggum. And looking at her match to Wiggum, you see in this slide here, she has a match whose ancestor was Thomas William Wiggum. They were in Georgia, not Jefferson, a little further away. But this Thomas William Wiggum was in the family of my Wiggum. So Crystal has a DNA match to this name that was not aware of. This is something she needs to investigate. And her matches are actually like third and fourth cousins on her father's side. So if you see there at the top, they're third cousins 2 times removed. So about 5 generations from herself is where she needs to be looking for that connection, that ancestral connection to the name Wiggum, which is literally in the family that enslaved my ancestors, and they actually went to Barber County, Alabama. So this is one reason why working together and looking at each other's DNA, we're able to see the bigger picture than if we just work alone. This was her match to the surname Hannah, Crystals. So she had someone named Sarah Brown, and Sarah Brown in her tree had a William S. Hannah. William was born in 1806 in South Carolina, but he ended up in Troup County, Georgia. So the similarity and the commonalities of these surnames is something that we strongly have to investigate. I'm not saying that this is, definitely a dead stop or something that truly says that hands down, this Hannah is the line that she's matching in. But her and I need to investigate this further because she has Wiggum and she has Hannah, and they're in Georgia, where my family was enslaved. And so I also have a connection to her through her Patterson and her Proctor line, more of her Proctor line. And so this is hinting to me that this could possibly be those connections that take me back to those free persons of color and the ancestors, that the original ancestors here. Now, Rodney, this is a conversation about our cousin Rodney. Rodney's line was Washington. And in looking at the possible connection to him, Rodney actually is a descendant that's falling under George Washington's brother or in the family of George Washington. What we have to remember and keep in mind when we're talking about the signs of the time, that the Johnsons of Frederick were tight friends with George Washington. Thomas Johnson, oh gosh, he wasn't a married. I forgot his title. I'm a little tired. Thomas Johnson, who was the first governor. Thomas Johnson, the first governor of Maryland, encouraged George Washington to have slaves, as it is written, was a proponent of slavery, served in the war. So all of these enslavers are working together, learning how to do their business together, supporting one another's initiatives. So in seeing that Rodney has a connection to George Washington that he's still working on and he's still building, but his DNA connects him to that, as well as his DNA matches that he has connects him to that. So as he looks for his matches that are in Virginia or West Virginia, and he's trying to learn the DNA matches that are high matches are telling him you have a match to a descendant of George Washington's line. And we know that George Washington and the Johnsons were collectively together. So it's like, okay, that's something that we have to consider. And then these are some of his Rodney's matches in Jefferson, Georgia. So as he takes the time to look at these matches and he's trying to see what's in their tree, and then I would look, matter of fact, yes, Miss Elizabeth.
So, Delbra, that's not George Washington.
That person was not, no.
Oh, okay. I just
Yeah.
wanted to, yeah,
no,
okay.
this was in the family of George Washington. So he's not a direct descendant of George Washington. He's in a brother, a nephew. So he's still investigating that.
Well, a lot of people named their children George Washington because,
Yeah.
it was a very
Popular name at the
common,
time.
yeah, because, it's like Lincoln and some other names that people really, I just wanted to make sure because, yeah. Okay,
Understandable.
great. All right, thanks.
They no, thank you. But it's definitely something he still has to do the work and investigate. But as we're looking at trying to understand the DNA connections and what's common for us, if you see here, and I didn't highlight it, but he has a match that's managed by Donna Wiggum. So I asked Rodney, do you have matches to Hannah's and do you have matches to Wiggum that are DNA matches? And he did. So, like Crystal, he also had matches to Wiggum's and Hannah's in Georgia. So this is a match that he has for Rodney, and all that I'm showing here is that this particular match was not of African descent at all. So what he would basically end up being able to see and to do as he's investigating is use the origin to be able to see, are they descendants or have any African American descent or no? Because now this allows us to understand that we might be needing to look at the enslaver as far as our connection. Did you have another question at all, Miss Elizabeth?
Also, let me just say this. As I am investigating, all jokes aside, as I am investigating my Washington side, if any one of you should come up with some evidence that you would like to share with your cousin, I could use all the help I can get. I'm new at this, but I'm trying to do my best.
Well, that's one reason why we're in the group, right? We're in the group to try to learn from each other, and each of us brings different information that helps us grow and gain more knowledge.
Thank you, because what I'm learning about fishing is that, first of all, I need to learn how to fish, because right now I feel like I got a pole out there trying to fish and don't know where to fish, what the fish look like, or how to use a pole. So again, yes, I am investigating. I'm getting better health-wise, praise God. But as I continue my investigation, I'm brilliant because I know I'm not. Therefore, I go to people who are, and
Absolutely.
that makes me brilliant.
Absolutely.
Hint to all of my cousins.
We're all trying to be brilliant, Mr. Rodney. Now, so next I go to, so Rodney, and the reason why all of these people are shared is because we do share DNA connections to one another. So Donald. So Donald is someone that's in our group, and he's been connected to the descendant group for a few years. I think he said 3 years. As I looked at his tree and as I started trying to understand his stories, he has probably more. I think he has 7 connections to Frederick. And in my trying to understand all of his connections and how he's related to me and looking at his tree, these are the things that we have to do to just figure out where are our connections at. So one of the things I will share with Donald, his first connection is to the Graham surname. And this is a name that he has worked on, and as he shared with me, that he's spoken with Elizabeth about. He's had conversations with the people at Rose Hill about the Graham surname, as Thomas Johnson gave Rose Hill as a gift to his daughter. I don't, but he didn't build the building, but build the plantation or the land or what was on the land, but he acquired it and then he gave it as a gift to his daughter when she married Colin Graham. And so in understanding, we have to understand the Johnson story, we have to understand the Graham story. And so we're trying to figure out where are these connections. But it was really cool to see that Donald has a strong connection that has been identified and vetted with the society, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but and those who are at Rose Hill. And maybe he's still trying to continually to vet it, but this is something that has been investigated. Yes, Miss Elizabeth.
Did you say Caroline? Caroline Worthington Graham?
Somewhere I think she'll come up.
No, I'm
Haven't
saying
said her yet.
the connection of
Right.
Donald.
I'll show it.
Um,
It may come up here. So there's Charles, and because what I tried to do is basically show, but she's gonna come up, yes. So when she comes up, you can tell us the story, okay?
okay.
Okay, thanks. Because she should come up. So this is basically just showing that as I needed to look at, so we knew that the daughter was a Johnson, but now I needed to understand the Graham side of the story. And so in looking at Charles Graham and looking at his possible probate will records because he died 1779, I have to make sure I found probate records on him, but I did because Major John Collins was a son. I didn't find probates for him, but John Collins' father was Charles. I needed to know all of his siblings just so that I could try to get an understanding of the relationships. And so Richard Graham was someone else who I believe received slaves and who is tied to Donald. So this is Major John Colin Graham, and he married Anne Jennings Johnson, who was a Johnson. And then from there, Richard Graham, and Richard Graham, I believe, is he is the son of Charles, and James Graham was, I believe, Uncle John Colin Graham was the uncle to John Colin. So this is about really just trying to research and traverse the lines to understand where the connections tie. And it was in here where James Graham, who was the uncle to John Colin Graham, I'm sorry, had enslaved Donald's family. And this was Donald's family to that. And let me see if I do believe I have Catherine, and maybe she's coming up next because I want to make sure you could share that story with us. But basically, this is Donald's connection here, John H. Graham. But John H. Graham, his ancestor was actually enslaved by a gentleman named Frederick Eichelberger. So he was the enslaver. I don't know the connection to the Eichelbergers to Donald. I'm not certain if there were any children, but basically it was important for him to know the name Eichelberger. And so, yes, Miss Elizabeth.
Well, the Eichelbergers, and this is what we know about Donald's family, are in the Kriggerstown district in a very large house on Blacksmill Road, that is maybe about a mile east of Catoctin Furnace. So we see clearly Donald's connection with the Eichelbergers.
Okay. Interesting. So why were they the slave were they managing the slaves?
No, the Eichelbergers had a large farm. And again, the structure still, it's not in very good shape, but it still stands, with an 18th century, belt course, large brick structure off Big Hunting Creek. He was what I would consider a well-to-do farmer in the Kriggerstown district of Frederick County, Maryland.
Okay. Interesting. So I haven't had an opportunity to have, or maybe Donald may not know, but interesting. So the slaves went from James Graham possibly to the Eichelbergers. So
No, I think the Eichelbergers would have been, I'm pretty sure, and Caroline is the person, anyway, I think the Eichelbergers would be, or earlier.
okay. Oh, they were earlier. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have those notes in front of me, but I'm fairly certain that they're quite early, late 18th century.
Awesome. That's helpful to know the order of how the slaves came into be with who their enslaver was. So another connection that Donald has is the Ross family. Are you familiar with the story of Donald and the Rosses, Elizabeth?
Well, the Ross family married into is part of the Bryn family. So yes,
Okay.
they, yes, I'm very familiar with the Ross family.
But I mean, as it pertains to Donald and his connection to them.
No.
Okay. Okay. So in understanding that connection, as has been documented from Donald, um, that this person here, Major William Ross, who was in Pennsylvania, basically had this daughter, Christiana Jane, and William Francis Ross Jr., and Mary Hannah Ross. And basically, what happened with this is that in his Ross line, in his Ross connection, Major William Ross had a wife, had married at least twice, I believe, a Nancy McCoy and a Mary Hannah Ross. And this was the first time from Donald's tree I saw the name Hannah. And this is what perked me up with understanding, is this where the Hannahs have a connection to Frederick or to the area, let me say, to that area. And so then Donald and I spoke about this possible Ross connection. And this was something that we were working on and we were working to vet. But let me see here. So William Francis Ross then had a slave named Harold Ross. And Harold Ross is where Donald's family line comes into play there through that line, where Patricia Priscilla Graham Ross, which is Donald's connection. So he has ties to this Ross line as well. And it makes sense because Harold Ross was 17 early, like what you said earlier than the 1800s. So maybe when Mr. Alco, I'm not certain, this still has to be vetted with Donald and I, but this is where his Ross came into connection with the Hannah surname. And this was just showing Donald's story, his connection to the Grahams, the Rosses, and the Eichelbergers. He has them as being the enslaver. So what I was sharing here was just a little history that we have to learn about as we're researching these names. But one of the earlier Eichelbergers who died in Frederick, when he died in 1830, these were some of the slaves that were listed in his will. This is not all. This was just a quick search of trying to identify, were there any slaves and could any of these names be connected to him? So this is something that we would work with him to be able to see, is this where we could find maybe some of his missing female slaves, family members, as it's documented in other records.
Excuse me, did you mention a Ross in Delaware?
I didn't mention a location at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't mention the location, but I think these at the moment here are all Frederick Rosses.
Okay, because
Or Pennsylvania.
Because I noticed that in one of my matches trees that there is a George Aranus Ross Jr. who was born in Newcastle, Delaware, but he died in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So there definitely were, as I started learning, looking at Donald's connection to me, it started opening up the conversation in my head that Pennsylvania is a state that I have to pay attention to. As they were coming in, especially I'm learning the Germans, and I'm not saying that they were German, but as they came in and settled, then they were moving south, and may have settled in Frederick, may have moved on. But yeah, so for Donald, this was particular here is the Ross family in where they were free persons of color. And I thought he was going to be on tonight because I was hoping that this could have been an open connection to him to be able to track some of his ancestors that were Rosses and that were identified as free persons of color, so that now he could be able to see maybe more of the family structure of them. So I will be sharing that with him as well. But this little chart that I created here basically was just a high level overview of how I'm trying to figure out how are we DNA related through these surnames. What's the commonality that we potentially could be having between these surnames? And number one was Thomas Johnson's daughter, Ann Jennings Johnson, married Colin Graham. Also, Major John Collins' brother was James Graham. James Graham fathered a son, George H. Graham, by a slave, Patricia Ross. And that was Donald's connection. The child of James Graham, which is 4 under the Grahams, was Donald's ancestor, George H. Graham, born 1829. And number 5 that moved over to the Rosses, Harold Ross's enslaver fathered a child by an unknown slave. So that was Donald's connection to the Rosses. So this is just a visual, really, of me just trying to understand these families and how they're intertwining, how they're doing business, and how our possible connections may be unfolding. Okay. Donald's connection to Hannah. And so he has, so what I was able to find when I looked at Donald's tree at first, he had a woman named Hannah, but he didn't have any parents for her. He had Mary Hannah, married a Ross with no parents. And I said, okay, so the Hannahs are in fact near Frederick. So let me search for information about this Hannah surname and see if we can try to find the commonalities between the Hannahs, his Hannah and my Hannah. And of course, there's other Hannahs. There's more family that has to be vetted. There's more family that has to be researched. I'm not saying that it's not. There's a lot of work that has to go into making sure we can cross the T's and dot the I's. But we have to know where we can look at least at first. So, but his Mary Hannah, again, married William Ross, had the son William Ross II, and thus William Ross married Catherine Johnson. And that ties us back to the Johnson family. And there's Catherine Griffin Worthington Johnson. I know I had this name somewhere, Miss Elizabeth. It was connected under the Johnson surname.
Is it Catherine or Caroline?
I'll relook. I thought it was Catherine. But depending on whose record you're looking at, and actually it was Catherine because she was listed in some probate records.
Okay.
There may be after I go back and look, because I track, as you can see here, there was a Sons of American Revolutionary membership, and maybe they may have gotten the name wrong. You know, over time, I think
Baker Johnson married Catherine Worthington.
Yes.
So is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. And then they had the daughter, Catherine Johnson, who married Mr. Ross. You're saying there was a Caroline. That's your question.
Caroline is the person who inherited Sook. I thought that's where we were going. Not Catherine. Caroline inherited Sook, not Catherine. Catherine married Baker Johnson's wife was definitely Catherine Worthington.
Mm-hmm.
They had 10 kids, and Caroline Worthington Goldsboro married Thomas Graham. And in Baker's will, Sook went to Caroline, not Catherine. Let me double check that. Hold on one second. Caroline inherited Sook, Jacob, her son, Lucinda, who is Pris's daughter, Christina, Len, and Hannah. Caroline, not Catherine.
So she inherited this from Baker's will?
Yes. Caroline Worthington Johnson, Baker's eighth kid? I've lost track.
Yeah,
so many kids.
She was down the line.
Caroline was number 7. She inherited from Baker some years prior because, she was younger.
Oh,
Sook, Jacob, Lucinda, Christina, Len, and Ned and Hannah. Those are the people. Now, I will say this. We believe that in order to keep their wealth, as the Johnsons were, things were good, things were bad, they were they were selling or lending, perhaps. I
yes,
don't know how
yes,
you would phrase this.
yes,
They're enslaved within the family.
yes,
Okay. So they were keeping them within the family.
yes,
So it is possible that Sook went to, um, even though Caroline inherited Sook
she did.
and her son Jacob and
Mm-hmm.
Lucinda, Christina, Len, Ned, and Hannah,
Mm-hmm.
within the next couple years, it's possible that they lent them to
Somewhere else,
other members of the immediate family.
somewhere else.
But they did not leave the family. This is an important point.
So in this piece here, yeah, so as you can see, I did track that Carolyn received the slaves.
Right.
And as you can see in my tree for Caroline, I have nothing more because I did not research as it pertained to what could have happened to Sook in this time period here. But you're saying Caroline married a Graham? Yes, she married a Graham up there, right?
Yeah, she married her first cousin, Thomas Graham.
That's what happened. And I thought I saw that. Okay.
Mhm.
Interesting. Okay. So again, that's why it absolutely helps for us to. So one thing that I want to be able to highlight here in even in the presentation that I have, right? It's all of the having the information is pivotal for us, for those of us that are looking to be able to understand where we're looking and what we're looking at and how we're looking. What most likely could happen, because I can show you in my tree the sook that I have, because family members named people after others. If the sook, I'm losing my track of thought because I did not further this Caroline line to understand what happened with sook here. But and so what happened to this subset of family when she died in 1831? Was there a will for Caroline? Did they go to her husband?
I'm not an expert on the Graham. After they leave Catoctin, I have multiple Johnson genealogies that I've gotten from Kansas, from New York, and from other sources, but this is not my expertise. I do, however, know, and they're working on it um, for Donald. Uh, but one is on maternity leave. Anyway, Amanda and Carrie are working on this for Donald right now.
Okay.
But this is not my expertise, so I can't speak to, I'm sorry. I
Oh,
can
no, no, no.
try to
That's quite
figure it
okay.
out, but I can't say.
No, 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 that's okay. What I will ask, can they include me in this information sharing?
Yeah, they're going to. They're working on it, and they absolutely will be sharing it. Absolutely. They're trying to help Donald, because figure this out because, and remember at Rose Hill, with the Grahams, and they were downtown in Frederick as well. This is also where we see the Summers family. They're at Catoctin, they're at Rose Hill, they're back at Catoctin, and then they're at Antietam. So they're moving them through space.
So when the slaves were sold to Antietam, did this include? So you did ask me, did I know where Sook went? And I don't know if the question was pertaining to after Carolyn died, or did I know that Carolyn received Sook? Because that was the question you asked me the other day.
No, Caroline definitely got Sook.
Right. But you had asked me, did I know where Sook went? So is there after she died?
Well, there's something very curious about that name because the Ross family on downtown Frederick, right?
Mhm,
They there's there's a in the next what would be the next generation, okay? And this is a leap. We can't make this,
mhm,
but this is just, there is a Sook, Suck, and she was 16 in 1821. So she was born in 1804, 1805. So she could have been, if you look at the date of our Sook at the vineyard, who is old enough to have had a child, Jacob, in the 1811 will, and actually in the 1809 will, because remember the will was written in
mhm.
1809, but it wasn't Baker didn't die until 1811.
Right,
So if she's born, she could easily have had a child who would be 16 in 1821, and her name is Sook,
right,
Suck, and she's behind in the slave quarters behind the Ross house from 1817 until 1843. Now, I'm not saying that's the same person, but there
mhm,
is a Sook, Suck,
right.
in the Ross enslaved quarters in Frederick until 1843.
I think I did see that in, I did see the name again, Sook, in trying to understand those.
It's different though. It's not Sook.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
again, it's
spelling
the
variations and
spelling is is problematic
yeah,
because they spelled it the way they wanted to spell it.
very true. Well, one of the things that and so this really, so all of these were really just trying to share how these identifiable surnames were, and I'm going to jump down here, were really just in doing business with one another and in being mindful of the relationships that they had. Because once Georgia opened up, Donald had family members that literally went to Jefferson, Georgia, that were coming from the Grahams and coming from the Rosses. And I don't know the time period because I have not looked at that. But in the time period of Donald's connections to Wiggums and Hannah's in Jefferson and his ties to these family lines, the question was, how did they get and why did they go to Georgia? And a great deal of it was the opening up the land. And now they want to move toward that land to be able to, um, expand their wealth. So this is where in the group here, what we're trying to do is to understand this tracking. And so what I'm basically, so I think this was just, what is this? So this was just a great deal of me sharing the tracking of their slaves, how many slaves they had, where they went. And this was the tracking of all where all the slaves went. And then when they died, retracking that. When the daughters married, retracking that. So that is the things that I do. That is the things I'm trying to encourage the group to do. If we're to understand these relationships and we're to understand these possibilities and these connections, the conversation of is my Sook this Sook? Absolutely. There's going to be further research that needs to be had because I don't know all of this information. And the more that we share with each other, the further that we can go to solidify the data. The long story short of what I was going to share really was the summation was Donald, um, you know, the, not just the three of them, many of us in this group have ties to the Jefferson, Georgia, and other parts of Georgia where the Grahams and or the Rosses were in looking at Donald's tree. Um, Many people have ties to Jefferson, Georgia. Um, Understanding that Donald's Ross was connected to a Hannah and the overall conversation about my Sook. I'll give you the take on my Sook. I'll just jump to that part here. So, and it actually even has more of a backstory than this that I was just reading a few minutes ago before the meeting. But Thomas Hanna's father, according to this document here that was done, Thomas Hanna's father, there was actually a research done in Jefferson, Georgia, on what's called this Queensboro Hanna's Quarter. And just like what has happened in Frederick with the cemetery, the excavation of the graves, that's what this report was speaking to. And that report was speaking to my ancestors, which were my Hannas and my Wiggums. But the other side of that Wiggum conversation was one of the Wiggums, in one of these slides I'm going to show, one of the Wiggums. So let me back up. I need to say this. This report was done in 2002, and this is 2024. So 22 years ago, a report was done on the Hannas in Georgia. Long before any of us started adding DNA anywhere, being tested, long before Ancestry really blew up the way it has, this report was done. So they were not able to find many of the ancestors, many of the descendants of the slaves that were associated with this Hanna name. And so now, with the advancement of technology and DNA, we're able to expand these research a lot further. This is really just saying that when William Hanna came to Georgia, he had no slaves. Of course, they didn't. His son was just a teenager. So this is really just my trying to document the connection between the Hannas, the Wiggums, and then I started realizing that Donald actually has a connection to his Hannas, and they were in Wiggums in Georgia. This is my Sook and all of her children in their glory. So my Sook, Mr. Hanna died. I said she was born about 1790. Mr. Hanna died in 1818. So he died 7 years after, or 1809, 9 years after Baker, 17 years after the slaves were actually allocated. And these were all of the names. So you were asking me about some of the other names. So, and I'm trying to think, there was a Hanna that married, not a Hanna, my Hanna married a Wiggum. And this is really just showing all of the DNA matches that are actually connected to the Hanna and Wiggum surname. Donald is connected to Wiggums as well. And one of the Hannas married a man named Beatty. And what I believe in theory, Mr. Beatty, that name was prominent as a slave trader. The Beatey or Beatty was known to be slave traders. And a Beatty married a Wiggum in Georgia. And that was in my Wiggum line, and also that was in Crystal's line. So those family connections that are so closely, that's what I'm trying to do. That's what we're trying to do. Research these lines to better understand what these relationships were. And this is where I'm sharing that a Beatty actually married a Wiggum. And this Wiggum is Crystal's DNA matches surname. So to the summation of is Sookin Frederick my Sook? Absolutely. More information has to be researched. I believe I'm gathering really strong leads that is pointing me in the direction of where to look. The information that you can share, Elizabeth, or anyone that can share with what you already know can help me and us really come more up to speed with whatever our surname research is. And that's the reason why we were asking for where's the sources, because the sources is what's going to help drive that information. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Miss Elizabeth. Your hand is up, Elizabeth?
Yeah, could you scroll back up? I apologize. It looked like that showed that Sook was from the UK.
Oh, no, it said unknown. That's the acronym you
Oh,
use for unknown.
unknown what?
Last name.
Okay,
Yeah, that was just unknown.
okay.
Yeah, it was just unknown.
Well, I just, there's one thing about the Ross and Graham family that is possibly important information, possibly not. But it appears that they, and perhaps we've missed it, or perhaps we just haven't looked hard enough, but it does not appear that they were selling their enslaved. Now, have you found otherwise?
The Ross is new to me and the Grams. I only discovered this name when I finally connected with Donald, and now I'm looking at his tree because thankfully, what we do with one another, we are sharing our trees with each other so that we could try to, get an understanding of this information that we need to be looking at. And so I can look at his tree to be able, because I know for a fact his Rosses ended up. No, I wanted to see DNA matches. I wanted to be able to see his DNA matches in to the Wiggum name and or in Georgia, because what that does is it helps us to be able to understand that the slaves from Frederick got moved to Georgia. And so the conversation is, why did they migrate? Why did they leave? Most likely they were purchasing land. So the slaves moved. And I can't say that, I'll be honest with you, to answer that question now, I better understand what you're asking me. They did not necessarily sell them. They absolutely kept them within the family. So they ensured that the women had slaves, the grandchildren had slaves. They actually literally kept the slaves within the family, yes. So if these slaves were coming from Frederick and then are coming into Georgia, but then they're doing business with one another and then their families are intermarrying, that's one other reason why they're going to be, in close proximity and in close surnames with each other.
Well, there's one Johnson who died in Tallahassee, Florida, but I have not found any Johnsons with any connections to Georgia. Have you?
No, I have done a lot of work. There was a Vespasian Johnson that's in Donald's tree. He was, I
That's
believe,
not a John. That's not a Johnson name from the Ross Johnson line.
so, but this is the thing though. We got to go back to the fact that the Johnsons of Frederick actually were born in Calvert.
Yeah,
And,
oh, I
and
know. No,
And so the question to that, or the statement to that is, so Calvert was here, the Johnsons moved to over here, but that family was here. And we would have to track the family to see which of their family members went to Georgia so that we could understand the relationship. Is there one? And I don't think people have done it in that way, but that's what I would do, me myself, when I'm in that space to want to understand how are they closely related, is building the tree of the family to be able to see who migrated and went to Georgia and to understand, are they really related, though it wasn't documented. A great deal
well,
of
the Johnsons are very, very, very well documented, as you can imagine.
Absolutely,
You
but
know,
most of them were prominent. They in the war they had high positions. A great deal of the research I said, a great deal isn't known of them because they were not prominently known. And so, other than when they became a governor, and then for whatever reason they lost track of who the family is. Those are the things I don't know. But someone somewhere is documenting them, and it's just about putting those pieces together.
well, no, what I'm saying to you is that the Johnson, I mean, there are multiple Johnson, really detailed Johnson genealogies and histories, really detailed. There's one in
Mhm.
the New York Public Library that we've pulled. There's one that we pulled from James Lewis Johnson, because he went to Santa Fe, and there were records at the Santa Fe Historical Society. And of course, there's an enormous amount of information on the Johnsons in Frederick because they're still there. They're still in Frederick.
Mhm.
And other than the one gentleman that one went to Michigan and one went to Tallahassee, Florida, but I don't recall anybody going to Georgia.
At this moment, I definitely have not found anything that says the Johnson in Georgia is the Johnson in Frederick. I have not found that to date. What I can say though is the Beatty name was in Frederick, and the Beatty name does have a close association to the Beatties in Georgia. The Beatties also married into the Wiggum name, as well as Beatty and Johnson, which I have not. What was shared with me was that I will say that Angie shared some information with one of the other cousins that I don't know how she researched it, but it was shared with me that the Johnson and Beatty that sold the slaves with associated with the GU 272 were supposedly tied to Frederick. I would have to revet that because I have not found that connection, but that was shared. Angie had shared that, and then I spoke with the person she was speaking with, and she shared something with me to that point. All of these are leads that continually still have to be vetted. But if they were doing such close business with one another, then it helps to lead to where we need to research. And that's my point in all of this. It really is still about finding the documentation, understanding the family structures. The families named their children and their descendants after their family. And so those just become good leads for us to follow when trying to understand the connections.
Mhm.
But literally Donald's family moving from Frederick to Georgia and him having connections to my Hannahs and my Wiggums became that strong conversation of, is this where this connection is? But honestly, I do not believe it stops at the Sook from Baker. I believe it goes to Sook's family that came from Calvert or came from Prince George or Anne Arundel, wherever they came from. And for instance, you had shared that Charles Carroll sold slaves to Johnsons. I would love to see those names because it would help for us to be able to see, is this the structure of the family as one source. There's many sources. I mean, they were buying and selling slaves all over the place.
Well, we don't have names. I mean, that's part of the problem, of course. That's the difficulty. We just, there's no
Oh,
names.
in that particular cell, there was no name.
Right,
Okay,
exactly.
gotcha. Oh, it's got to be a name somewhere. We just got to find it. And absolutely, it's possible that there's not. But again, that's why we have to lean on DNA. And DNA was not something that was in play in conversation for many years. All we had were records. So there's going to be some things we cannot justify. There's going to be with what slavery was. There's going to be some data points we cannot cross the T and dot the I on. We might get as close as 90%, 85 if we're lucky. And for me, I'm trying to shoot for as much as humanly possible. But having so strong ties to all of the cousins who have ties to Frederick, who then have ties to the Calvert, Maryland, I mean, all the other areas of Maryland, this is what leads us to really come together to try to research and figure this out. So, again, I would not necessarily have shared this had it was not what I feel forced upon me, because I like to continue to do my research until I really find it. Finding Donald had Hannah was a breakthrough that was amazing for me because it helps put my Hannah from Georgia possible converse connection to the Hannah in Frederick, and that Hannah actually came from Pennsylvania. Um, and again, these families are not very well documented. A great deal of it is a family could have come here and landed in um, Pennsylvania, whereas the conversation was my Hannah, as it appeared, landed in Georgia. Well, they landed in Georgia at a different period of time. They could have been uncles, they could have been brothers, they could have been siblings. But yes, some of that is not very well documented. So being able to see the connections through these family lines is all we may have until we find resources like records. Did you have another question?
Well, no, I was looking at the chat. Um,
Oh,
Henry Johnson's dad was the brother of Baker Johnson's dad. Baker Johnson's dad was who said that and where are they getting that? Thomas Johnson's um Thomas Johnson's father was Thomas Johnson. Baker was Thomas's brother. Um, who is Isaac? Who is Isaac?
That's coming from the chat, right?
Yeah, it looks like Hope put that in. Hope Jones wrote that
Right.
in.
So Thomas, Thomas Baker Johnson's dad, as you said, was Thomas. What I have, I'm not saying
Right.
I'm 1000% right, but then what I have, and it just gets so wonky because different people are having different information. But I have another Thomas was his dad, and the mom was Carswell Baker, Mary Carswell Baker. What you believe, is that correct?
No, no, because Thomas was Thomas was the elder son of Sir James Johnson and Dorothy Scotlow, born in Yarmouth County, Norfolk in 1680, died in Calvert County. So I don't know who these people are that you have.
Hmm.
I have gotten, the Johnsons have been, as you can imagine, even starting in the 1840s, they started writing down their genealogy, whatever you
Right.
want to call it.
Right.
So I'll scan these and share them, but
Okay.
Thomas Johnson, his father was Sir James Johnson and his mother was Dorothy Scotlow. And then he they came to England. They came from England. And then Thomas Johnson, orphaned at an early age. He married Dorcas. Well, we know that. And
Right.
so I don't know who, I've never seen the name Isaac. And you know how these families were, they just kept using the same names over and over and over again.
Right.
I've
Right.
never seen the name Isaac in the Johnson line.
Yeah, this was where, yeah. So
Or Peter. That's not a name they used either. It was Joshua, John, Baker, Roger, Elizabeth,
sure,
Dorcas, Thomas, Rebecca, Benjamin, and they over and over and over again, they used those names, Catherine, Dorcas, Elizabeth, but never an Isaac, and never an Isaac, or never a Peter. No way. It's the wrong family.
awesome. So if you can get us so that we have facts, actual facts compared to our researching, and we're not sure what we have, because as you can see, like from what I have here, because they repeated the names, I have added wills, but then other people have different things in trees, but then we see the SAR record. And as we're trying to understand what's in, and so this SAR record went with Dorcas, I believe.
Yeah, well, Dorothy, she's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
Dorothy. And Dorcas is the wife of Thomas.
Of
I mean,
Thomas.
of Thomas. Yeah,
Yep, yep, yep.
that's right. And you up there in the right-hand corner, Dorothy Scotlow, she's still in England. Absolutely.
No, I
But
know.
these other people, Peter, I don't know who these people are.
Yeah, this Mary Ring and where she came from. So yeah, so this is why it's important for us to work together.
If you go back to the chat, Hope said Isaac was Henry Johnson's dad. Isaac and Thomas were brothers. Thomas was the father of Johnson brothers that owned the furnace, and she found the information online.
I've never heard the name Isaac, and I've never heard, who's Henry?
So it's Henry Johnson?
Yes. She said Isaac was Henry Johnson's dad.
I don't know who Henry Johnson is, and I don't know who Isaac is.
Well,
not
everyone be sure to save the chat that you may be able to go back and check after that.
Yeah, true.
Do some checking from the chat.
Oh, okay. So wait a minute. What I might be able to glean some information on this Isaac Johnson at least. So Isaac Johnson is the son of Joshua Johnson. That's where she got that from, because I researched that too. Joshua Johnson had some business dealings in, so this was a question I had based on the research that I had done. So there was a Joshua Johnson who was, that's where she's getting from, Baker's brother. Because I have the same thing in the tree based on
Yes,
some
Joshua was in London. Joshua,
Yes, it would go
yes.
back and forth. Yes.
Well, Joshua's children were Nancy, Louisa, Caroline, Harriet, Catherine, Elizabeth, Thomas,
Yep.
and that's it.
Yep. I
So
have
there is
some,
no
not a
Isaac.
lot more. I can't say about an Isaac, but so the Joshua, I'm trying to remember if where I was looking for Joshua, I could not connect him to Georgia. That's why you see this question marks.
No,
Was he
he
in
was in
Georgia?
England and
Yeah.
France.
Yeah, he used to go back and forth. I did see he was
No, he lived in England. He lived in England.
okay.
And he went to France during the Revolution. Then he went back to England, and his daughter became First Lady. She's Louisa Johnson Adams. She married
Right
John
there.
Quincy Adams.
Yep, right there.
So
Yep.
that's who Joshua is. And his children again were Nancy, Louisa, Caroline, Harriet, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Thomas. But there's no Isaac and there's no Henry.
Yes, Miss Hope.
Well, who's Henry Johnson? That's
Wait a
who
minute.
Isaac is supposed to be. Henry Johnson's dad. Is there a Henry Johnson?
No.
Hope.
Okay, this is what I was saying. Okay, from what I found online, I don't know if it's completely accurate or not. I'm bringing it up because maybe Elizabeth knows something about it. But so I found that Henry Johnson, he was, I believe, a governor and a senator, I believe. He had more than one duty at different times, okay, in Louisiana. So he purchased some of the Georgetown slaves. And from what I found online, the father of the Baker brothers that owned the furnace, their father was Thomas. Thomas had a brother named Isaac, and Isaac was Henry's dad. So that would mean that Henry Johnson was first cousins with the Baker brothers, meaning Johnson brothers, Baker, Johnson, and whoever else owned the furnace. So, I mean, I don't know if it's correct, but I found it online and it's something I think we need to investigate.
Because
Yes.
what basically she's saying is Baker Johnson's dad and the other brother, being brothers, one of the son went to Louisiana and he's involved in the GU 272 sale. And that would be potentially that connection. The Beatties were slave sellers, were selling slaves in Maryland and in Georgia because I researched that. And so I was trying to figure out what Beatties connected to the selling of slaves and that kind of thing, because Beatties are marrying Wiggums that are tied to Hannahs and all of these things. So that's why we're looking at the families in a cohesive way, or doing our best as best we can. But it's definitely based on Elizabeth's point. The more accurate information we have, the stronger we can be in our research.
So where was this Isaac or where were these people supposed to, are they born in England? We have no record of these people, Isaac or Thomas, or Isaac or Henry.
I think it's just something we have to further research and figure out if it's true and figure out how to figure out if it's true. Honestly.
So Thomas had two sons, Thomas and James. James was the younger son, born in 1650, and he became Sir James Johnson, and he had sons Thomas and Valentine. I don't know. These names just, I'll scan. This is all on our website. And by the way, we did fix all the links today. We apologize. We didn't realize that some of the links were broken. But if there's an Isaac, if there's a Johnson, we have multiple Johnson genealogies, and maybe they left out children. I don't know. But I don't know.
Something, again, we can consider, given the fact that they left Calvert and went to Frederick, again, that whole family that
Well,
was
only
with John.
Thomas. Oh, only Thomas went to Frederick. They actually didn't
Okay.
go to Frederick. They went to Annapolis. And Thomas then went to Washington County, to Green Springs Furnace, and then to Catoctin. But he's the only one that went to Catoctin, Thomas. And then he brought, the older, and then Baker,
Children.
of course, came in,
Children. His
and
children.
Joshua was in London. I'll make sure that we connect these so that you all can look at these.
Thank
These
you.
are genealogies, one of which was written in the 1840s. So they were pretty close to the original, the
Yeah.
original information.
Okay. Miss Hope?
Okay, so I just Googled it. So it says that Isaac Johnson was born 1721 in, and I'm probably going to say this incorrect, Antrim, Ireland.
Okay, they were not, they were English, they weren't Irish.
They weren't Irish. Okay.
No, and they were born in Yarmouth. And actually, Thomas went to Cambridge. He went to Gonville and Keys College. They were not Irish. And the Irish and the English were not getting along very well at that time. Now, the English had plantations in Ireland, but Antrim, County Antrim, I don't think it's the same family.
Okay, and maybe okay. I'll investigate it further, but I get what you're saying.
Please
Yeah,
do,
please.
Hope, because I'm really interested. The only possibility is that the Johnsons, they were in Yarmouth, which is in the Southwest, and maybe they had a plantation in Ireland, but it seems they were down near Norfolk, in the Southwest. Then they were fully English, not Irish.
Okay, were they in Virginia at all?
No, don't think so. They came to the mouth of St. Leonard's Creek in Maryland,
Mm.
in 1701. So really early. Could somebody have gone to Virginia? Maybe, but I don't know. But the other thing is the names don't match. There's no Isaac. There's no
There's
Isaac.
no.
Mm-mm. No.
Okay.
And
All
there's
right. Well,
no Henry.
I'll investigate it further because it looks like it's more than one thing that's on here.
Mm-hmm.
As far as information about him and where he came from. That one thing said Ireland, like I just said, but then this other thing I'm looking at now says that he was born in Virginia.
Which
That they
Isaac
came.
was? Yeah.
No, that he was, but at the same time, yeah. I need to investigate it further. I just wanted to ask that because I had seen that on more than one thing. I even saw it in like a wiki tree and some other stuff. And I mean, if it's not correct, it's not correct, but
True.
Something that I wanted to investigate.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make sure that we've collected multiple Johnson genealogies over the years. Not that we really, frankly, care about the Johnsons, to be perfectly frank about it, but we've collected them so that we can understand how these people were moving through space and time. And I'm going to make sure that these are available to all of you so that you can, because it is important. But the smoking gun is not the Johnsons, in my opinion, guys. It's the Brins.
The Grahams and the Rosses, yeah.
Brins.
Oh, you
Yeah.
said
Yeah, I
Brent?
mean,
Yeah.
it might be, but the thing that would made it really interesting, if it's correct, then it would explain how the GU 272, at least some of them, and the furnace, how they're connected.
See, I've never thought they were connected. I've never seen that, but maybe it's there. I would love to see that.
Yeah.
I
It
would
just
love to see that. Because
it's
for one thing, the Johnsons were Anglicans. They were not Catholics. And you know how it was in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. Never the twain shall meet. Um, so the whole Georgetown Catholic thing going on, for that to have been integral into an Anglican enslaved population would, I think, be very unusual.
but
Put the link in
they're
the chat, please.
the slave owners and the managers were not necessarily Catholics.
No, the owners were not Catholic. They were Anglican. They were absolutely not Catholic.
No, I
The
mean in
Johnsons.
Georgetown, the because the priests hired people to manage the slaves, and they themselves may not have been Catholics.
No, I'm telling you that none of these people in Catoctin were Catholic. That's what I'm
Yeah,
telling you.
right. Okay.
None of them. There was no Catholicism.
Mhm.
The closest Catholicism was in Emmitsburg because of Sister Elizabeth Ann Seton, um, and but not around Catoctin. There was not even a Catholic church.
But Catoctin didn't start. When was its inception? Like it was 1760s, before the Revolutionary War, right? Because that's
Yes.
right. It was right before the Revolutionary War, but those slaves came from somewhere, and that's the point here: is that those slaves came from wherever they were able to purchase or buy those slaves, which was what we're believing strongly, the GU 272 corner.
Well, the DNA, the longer you were in the New World, the more possibility you had to um, marry other Africans from other parts of Africa. Within the African continent, while there was movement, of course, there's also a homogeneity within, populations. So our DNA has shown very strongly that the majority of our people are only related to one or maybe two ethno-linguistic groups in Africa, which indicates that they are very recent arrivals when they then die at Catoctin. Very recent. So they have not had a chance in the New World to marry Africans from other parts of the continent. Africa is an enormous continent. So if you have someone whose DNA is from the north in Tunisia, and you have someone, and that person's DNA also goes all the way to the south and east in Mozambique or Zimbabwe. That indicates that they've been in the New World for multiple generations to have intermarried and gotten a very big mix of African DNA. So, what I'm saying to you is that we're finding what we perceive to be, and we could be wrong, but we perceive to be very recent arrivals. Because remember, Annapolis was a major slave port, and there were constant ships coming in. Even, and we're talking about the time of the Revolution, so it's before the transatlantic slave trade was out, became, of course, illegal, even though we all know it continued, but be that as it may. So we have these individuals being brought constantly to Annapolis, and Catoctin is a very short distance if you're looking for, if you're going to buy additional enslaved individuals, Annapolis is very, very close. So I understand what you mean about, intermarrying for multiple generations. And I will say that we have one toddler. Well, he's actually not a toddler. He's a neonate, who is related to eight. Now he dies unfortunately I think a 3-month old. He is related to eight ethno-linguistic groups. They range from the very tip of the north of Africa to the south. I mean, just enormous range. That, given the 18th century and the 17th century, is not what one would expect to have occurred within the enormous continent of Africa. So it looks like his ancestors were in the New World for multiple generations prior to his birth, but he's an outlier in our population.
I have a question.
From the cemetery.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, Elizabeth. It's very direct. The people in the area that are England, that came from England, can you find out if they had any relationship to the Portuguese?
Interesting. The Portuguese question has always been one. We don't see Portuguese DNA, but then we don't have the DNA. We have the DNA of some Johnsons that have entered, that wanted to be compared to see if they were, how they were related, if they were related to the enslaved in the cemetery. I have not come across, Rodney, yet any Portuguese DNA or Spanish, Iberian Peninsula, call it. We have not seen that yet. However, that would be very, very interesting.
The reason why I point that out is because in the 1500s, Portugal started sending, actually in the late 1400s, Portugal started sending out ships to Africa.
Absolutely.
And they set up what we could later on would call colonies in Africa. I also have a strong hunch that the Portuguese and the Spanish from Spain had a agreement when this whole thing about slavery began. And the English said, hey, you know what? They're making money and they are getting people to work for them. Why don't we join the party? And so I remember during this time, it was not unlikely that you would have families in Europe from one part of Europe to and another part of Europe be interrelated to each other. And so the DNA, because like Delbra would say, DNA don't lie, it verifies. I also say, this is me, it also clarifies. Okay? So you can't get around it. So my little take on all this is that I have a strong feeling that there's somebody from one family married somebody from another family that was a part of one part of Europe, went to England, and then they came to Maryland or Delaware. Because we have to understand one thing. During that time in history, see, here's our mistake. We think of Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, all the states as they are now. The world was a little bit smaller back in those days. So Maryland,
And fewer people.
and West Virginia, West Virginia in the 1700s was just Virginia.
Yeah, it didn't exist.
So all of these counties, the Marylands, everything, they didn't have to go too far before they were in the next state. They really didn't. So that's my take, and that's why I'm happy that my cousin Elizabeth is such an awesome researcher. We might have to get together on my Washington side. Oh, and by the way, Delbra, I just found out something. It might not have been Samuel. It might have been his half brother John, because John and his father were both slave masters.
You're going to research that, Rodney.
No, I have.
Okay, you're going to keep researching that. So to the point for tonight, I don't want to drag this. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for allowing me.
Our goal is to stand on truth, and we can't do that without the records, the research. There is a great deal. What I have seen from some of the documents is that there was a lot of slave trading going on, selling and buying. And, once we flush out that data and that information, and then we can speak with you about where were they from. And, there's a lot of work that has to be done, but I think together we could probably do a banging up job on this. I'm like Hope. I believe those Johnsons and those Beatties, I believe all of them did business together. They created those slave selling and managing your slave rule books that everyone abided by, regardless of their religious affiliations. Business was business. And if they were getting rid of slaves, they probably didn't care who bought those slaves. And so we just want to find our family, and we just want to find the truth. So thank you for helping us to be able to do that, because really that's what we're looking for. Is with whatever help you give us, it allows us to speed up what truth we want to be able to stand on and go forward. Thank you guys for coming. I'm going to sum up. Sook still needs some work and investigating. I'm kind of glad it was done, because it's helping us to be able to stand on what's true and not based on what we're believing, based on what we're finding. We want the right information, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is accurate and in truth, and that is what I want to do. But I will tell you, Elizabeth, DNA is becoming a game changer, and it really is helping us to focus our concentration instead of just researching all over the map and hoping we get a find. We now want to be able to get a more concentrated find. So thank you guys for coming tonight. I don't have another session until December, other than the research group, and I'll figure out when I'm going to be doing that. I'll probably only do that every other week. I don't want to burn people out. So thank you guys. Good night.
Thank you.
My heart
Bye.
is weird,
Thank
but
you.
there you go.
Bye.
BioTea.com. Our concentrate teas are special blends with a variety of herbs and spices that you just add to water. Once you mix and stir, you can enjoy them hot or cold. Find out how we make water better. BioTea.com. Drink your way to better health.